a while ago I was talking to a woman, and I had a Mjolnir on, and she was asking me about it and the beliefs and traditions behind it. And she said, "Well, what is it? What do you call it?" And I said, "It's heathenry." And she shuddered. She went, "Oh, heathen." And it just made me think, like, wow, I can only imagine what she must think a heathen is, and what people outside the community assume heathen and heathenry is. So I want to talk about here some of the misunderstandings and assumptions about what heathenry is, as well as the meaning and definitions of what is heathenry. Let's break it down. Journeys in Midgard, the Norse myths and the lore, and how it relates to us. Heathenry and spirituality. Welcome to the journey. So, what is heathenry? It's Germanic paganism. Heathenry is the pre-Christian Germanic peoples and their culture and civilization and traditions and beliefs. That's really what we're talking about here when we're talking about heathenry. And heathenry is used in the modern context as an umbrella term for all of Germanic paganism, for all of the pre-Christian Germanic people. So we're talking about the Norse, the Danes, the Saxons, the Anglo-Saxons, and there's other groups there as well. And so it's not only the Old Norse, there are other tribes and other peoples here. And that's how the word's used, and that's really what we're talking about in the meaning. So yes, it is the Old Norse ways. Yes, it's the Vikings, but not only the Vikings or the Norse. Heathen is a word with historical use. It was used in the Viking Age, that the Christians called the Vikings heathen. That they saw them as different, they had different beliefs, different culture, and so there's historical use and historical precedent for the word. And I think that's a reason why many of us use and embrace the word heathen, because it has historical use, and historical use talking about the pre-Christian Scandinavians. So that's a reason, I think. And also there is this sort of 1,000-year-old plus struggle between the Old Norse ways and Christianity, where Christianity came in and forcefully converted the Old Norse ways and throughout the world, really, and throughout Europe. And so when we use the word heathen, we're embracing our tribal culture, that our pre-Christian tribal identity, and we're reclaiming that word and reclaiming our traditions. This is my opinion, but I would say that's part of what heathenry is, that we're taking back the word, going back to our traditions, because Christianity is not necessarily our own spirituality. It was foreign belief that came in and eradicated and forcefully converted and called us heathens and pagans, and as if that was something derogatory, when it isn't. But more on that later. But there's that historical conflict between Christianity and heathenry, and one reason perhaps that people use the word heathen is to represent that I talked about, that perhaps they don't like the hypocrisy of Christianity, or being told what to do, or that they went around forcefully converting, and that also that heathenry is representing our own ways and our own culture, the pre-Christian ways. And I think that's a reason why we use and embrace the word heathen. And yet, although there's that 1,000-year-old conflict and struggle there, and the loss of our culture for 1,000 years, heathenry is not necessarily anti-Christian. And this is kind of a part of the assumptions and misunderstandings, I think, of the modern understanding of heathenry. That, and this is even in the dictionary, that there's these assumptions that heathenry might be atheist, anti-God, anti-Christianity, anti-religion, and that it might uncultured and uncivilized, or heathenry perhaps is a godless savage. I can only imagine what some people must think heathenry is, when really it's really none of these things. So heathenry is not atheist. It's not, it does not acknowledge the God in the Bible. We do not believe in the God of the Bible. We have our own gods. It's polytheist. It's many gods. It's Odin and Thor and Freya. So there's all these gods, and it's highly cultured and civilized. It's just a different kind of a culture and civilization. Norse mythology and these different expressions of a culture and a civilization. And so heathenry is not anti-Christian. Yes, there is a resentment from many heathens towards Christianity for 1,000 years plus, forced conversion, the demonization of our ways, and the loss of our culture for 1,000 years. Yeah, you get that. But I think for me, and possibly for other people, we're moving beyond that. We're not interested in holding resentments or in being anti-Christian, or we're not interested in Christianity. That's not part of our culture and beliefs. So we don't believe in the God of the Bible. And that is in the dictionary as well, not acknowledging the God of the Bible. It's part of a definition of heathenry. And I guess that is technically true, but that's kind of saying what heathenry isn't. We're not defined by not being Christian. We are defined by what we are, being followers of the Norse gods and being, the polytheist and the Germanic pre-Christian culture. Okay, so hopefully you got that. That made sense. So there's those misunderstandings and assumptions, even in the dictionary, that I would say are misleading and are not correct. There's some fallacies there in the dictionary. So I talked about heathenry as tribal culture, and that it's kind of reclaiming our traditions and our culture. And so that's another way of understanding what heathenry is, I would say, is that if we look at other tribal cultures that are still here to this day, like, say, Native American culture. Here where I live in New Zealand, there's Maori. Maori people are the indigenous native peoples of New Zealand, and they have their own tribal grounds. They have their own beautiful carved meeting halls and tattoo art and folk songs and mythology and language and all these expressions of a culture and tribal culture. And so like Old Norse and the other tribes, Germanic tribes, are the equivalent of something like Maori culture or a tribal culture that we all have, we all can, if we're interested. Not everyone cares about that, but that is another part of it. And I think that's another way of understanding what heathenry is. There are a few other ways that the word heathen is used. So I want to talk about that a little bit. So, like, for example, people might use the word pagan or heathen to talk about non-Christian, non-Muslim, non-Judaic peoples, particularly ancient peoples. But I think this is a kind of misuse of the word as well, or that it's using it a bit too broadly, that people might call the ancient Romans pagan before they were Christian. But the Romans used the word pagan toward other groups outside of Rome. They saw them as different than them, and they looked at them and called them pagan. The word pagan comes from the Romans, pagani, that they called the Celts pagan, because they saw them as different, they saw them as uncivilized and uncultured and not as advanced as Rome, something like that. And that they were rural country dwellers. They were more agrarian, more earthly, whereas the Rome was like city-states with big concrete walls and concrete adjoined buildings. And so, yeah, I don't think that using the word pagan and heathen in this broad way of anyone who's non-Christian or non-Abrahamic, I think it's a bit stretching it a bit far. The historical use of the word was like the Romans calling the Celts pagan, these earthly country dwellers that didn't have these built-up city-states and so on. But it was just a different culture. I wouldn't say the Celts or the Germans were backward or uncivilized. They had different culture. Anyway, I'm rambling a bit here, but there's these other uses of the word heathen and pagan. So like, in modern use, that I came across a group on Facebook who it was a heathen group, but it was not a Germanic, pre-Christian Germanic culture. It wasn't Germanic paganism. It was people who were atheist and were kind of against Christianity, and their whole thing about calling themselves heathen is a reaction against Christianity and being anti-Christian. And again, I think this assumptions and misunderstandings, or it seems to me anyway, that this use of the word being anti-Christian, and there are these uses of the word out there. So, but I don't think this is really part of what heathenry is. I talked about heathenry being pre-Christian Germanic peoples and culture, and yet here I am in the 21st century with the Thor's hammer on and part of heathenry. So I'm not pre-Christian. I'm here in the 21st century, and so this is modern heathenry, Neo-Heathenry, Reconstructionism, reconstructing what was lost, looking back towards the past, to the mythology, the Norse gods, the lore, the traditions, the culture, to reconstruct and bring back heathenry. So there's Neo-Heathenry, and that's another part of what heathenry is. And there's many different names and expressions for heathenry. Asatru is a very common one you might come across. And yet, Asatru, that name is a modern name. That was created, I think it was in the 20th century, and so it's a modern religion. It's not an ancient religion. Doesn't have a historical ancient use to the word. The ancient Norse did not, well, they didn't even call themselves Norse, but they didn't use the word Asatru for their religion. But heathenry does have historical use, was used. And so this is another reason why I call myself, why people use the word heathen, and so on. Okay, so that'll do. I think that was a pretty good breakdown on what heathenry is, dispelling hopefully some of the misunderstandings, or at least bringing to the conversation some ideas about what heathenry is. And so I would say that it's Germanic, pre-Christian, it's polytheist, it's many gods, and it's not atheist, it's not anti-Christian, it's not anti-God, it's not many of these things, assumptions that people have about heathenry. So that's it, that's my thoughts, that's my breakdown. Tell me what you think. What have I missed out? Or do you disagree with what I've thrown out there? Because I'm just putting ideas out there, contemplations, and let's talk about it.